All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Rabbi Hilly Haber. I'm the Director of Social Justice Organizing and Education at Central Synagogue in New York, and I'm also the co-chair of the New York Jewish Coalition on Criminal Justice Reform. And I'm joined today by several amazing presenters, and we'll have a conversation around criminal justice reform and the rise in violence around the country and how we kind of work around the tensions between those two things. But before we begin, I'll just ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves for a minute. Dr. Rosenfeld, do you want to start?
I will. Thank you, Rabbi. I'm Richard Rosenfeld. I'm an emeritus faculty member in criminology at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and I study crime trends.
Hi, I'm Thomas Apt. I'm a senior fellow at the Council on Criminal Justice, where I chair its Violent Crime Working Group, and I'm the author of Bleeding Out: The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence and a Bold New Plan for Peace in the Streets.
Good afternoon. I'm Faye Taxman. I'm a university professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. I'm stepping in right now for Dr. Chico Tillman. Dr. Tillman has a slight conflict. He was called upon to talk about violence prevention at the White House, but we do have a video for him, and we're hoping that he'll be able to show up later in our session today. And I want to recognize Bruce Turnbull. Bruce and I both co-chair the criminal justice reform effort at JCPA.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and Professor Taxman. Thank you for jumping in and joining us on the panel. And we look forward to hearing from Dr. Tillman later on. But Dr. Rosenfeld, do you want to start us off with your presentation?
I will. I'm going to share some slides, hopefully, and be right there.
That's perfect. That looks great.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I want to spend a few minutes talking about what's happened to crime rates, focusing on violent crime rates, homicide in particular, over the last few years since the beginning of the pandemic. The increase in crime, violent crime specifically, certainly made the news, and the rabbi suggested there may be some tension between efforts to reform policing and other criminal justice institutions with efforts to effectively address the rise in violent crime. I frankly don't think there's much tension. I think we need to proceed along both paths, and we can talk about that in the discussion. Let me quickly go to the next slide, if I can make this work. I've been looking at crime rate changes for the Council on Criminal Justice, where Thomas Apt works, for the last several years. Our most recent report, which I'll talk about today, was disseminated in January of this year, and it covers changes in those 10 offenses, both violent and property, from the beginning of 2018 to the end of last year, 2021. As should come as little surprise, homicide rates rose very sharply in 2020, the first year of the pandemic. We looked at homicide rates and other crime rates across a few dozen cities, and we saw a 30% rise in homicide during that year. Last year, 2021, the rise persisted in the cities we looked at, though the rate of increase slowed somewhat. So last year's average homicide rates across those cities was up 5% over the year before. Other crimes, however, most other crimes continue to fall. Property crimes fell during the pandemic, and those declines have persisted. Robbery, which is technically a violent crime, but shares with property crime the motivation to acquire something of value from a victim. Robbery also declined during the pandemic, and that decline persisted through most, though not all, of last year. Even with that sharp rise in homicide persisting into 2021, we are not back where we were as of the late 1980s and early 1990s. We're running roughly perhaps half of the overall homicide rate we saw during that period. There's the homicide, monthly homicide rate across the cities we looked at from the beginning of 2018 through the end of last year. As you can see, with most, most street crimes, homicide rates have a pronounced cyclical character. They tend to rise in the spring and summer and fall in the fall and winter. You see that peak that occurred during the summer of 2020, and then we get the cyclical fall into the latter months of that year, and a rise to another peak in 2021 summer, though that peak was somewhat smaller than the peak during the previous year. Let me point out too, and we can discuss this during the discussion period if you like, for most of the cities we looked at, the homicide rise was very abrupt. And it did not begin at the beginning of the pandemic. It began in late May and early June of that year, 2020. And you'll recall that the George Floyd murder occurred in May, late May of 2020. So we see some correspondence in time between the rise in homicide in 2020 and the emergence of mass protests over the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. The homicide rise and indeed the rise in other violent crime has not affected all communities equally. The rise has been concentrated in those very communities that have had chronically high levels of violence, and in particular firearm violence tied to racial disparity, racial segregation, poverty, and unemployment, the usual suspects when we're looking at levels of violent crime. And the increase is concentrated in the age group of young men who live in those communities. There's very little evidence, though there are claims to the contrary in some of the public debate, but very little evidence that the rise in homicide and firearm violence generally has spread to other groups or communities. There are numerous explanations, perhaps too many, for why we saw the rise in homicide. The list I'm providing here is neither exhaustive, nor are those explanations mutually exclusive. Clearly, the change in population activities, so-called routine activities during the pandemic had an effect, though the effect, I should say, was relatively complex on crime rates. The effect is more or less straightforward when we look at robbery and property crimes. Larceny rates went down, for example. Larceny is theft unaccompanied by force or breaking and entering. And when the shops are closed, there's no shoplifting, and that's a big chunk of the larceny rate. Robberies went down in part, certainly, because robbery is a heavily opportunistic crime. And when there are fewer suitable targets on the streets, as was the case during the pandemic, there are fewer opportunities for robbery. Reduced policing may have had some impact. We know that COVID had an important impact on policing, specifically on the number of officers who were not out on quarantine and out on the streets. And of those on the streets, Of course, in the early part of the pandemic, many were engaged in social distancing from persons they encountered on the street, and it's possible that contributed. There was a big drop, certainly, in police legitimacy, confidence, and trust in the police, especially in hard-hit communities of color. And there's a good deal of evidence suggesting that when the legitimacy of the police declines, we tend to see crime rates go up, violent crimes in particular. Also evidence that there were more guns on the street, and with more guns, we get more fatalities. The drug markets expanded during the pandemic. Drug overdose deaths had actually been declining for a few years prior to the pandemic. They went way up during the pandemic. People were acquiring their drugs on the street. Those drugs were often laced with fentanyl. So we see a rise in drug overdose deaths. And I've done research showing that there's a connection between homicide and the expansion of drug markets. Then, of course, there's the sheer stress and strain of the pandemic, which I think certainly contributed to the rise in anxiety, perhaps also aggression, feeding the increase in violent crime. Inflation, as of early 2021, and certainly into the present, inflation rates have been going up rapidly. There's a great deal of research showing a connection between the rise in inflation and the rise in crime, both violent and property crime. When prices rise, people tend to trade down, as the economists say. Some people trade down into the underground markets where stolen goods are available. And as the demand for stolen goods rises, that demand is met by increased property crime, increased robbery. And so we need to keep our eye on inflation and its, I think, likely impact on crime rates as we go forward. So let me stop there. I'd be happy to talk about policy. Others on the panel will be talking more about policy and anything else you'd like to talk about during discussion. Thank you, Faye. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rosenfeld. As you said, we'll have a chance to pick up on some of these questions more in our conversation. And I also want to invite anyone to put any questions they might have in the chat. Feel free to post anything and we'll pick those up later as well. Thomas will now present to us and help us think more kind of sharply about kind of what are we talking about when we talk about gun violence, and what are the ways that we can work to prevent gun violence.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. And I am charged with briefly summarizing some of the evidence about what works to reduce community gun violence. And that's obviously very challenging to do in a short period of time, but I am going to try to move quickly. I have a timer on my phone, so I'm going to try to keep this hopefully to 7 minutes, certainly no more than 10 minutes. So allow me to jump in. This is based on research that I performed while at the Harvard Kennedy School, along with Harvard's Chris Winship, where we analyzed more than 1,400 individual impact evaluations to get a good sense from the entire field of what was working and what was not working in terms of reducing community gun violence. And if you heard from Rick's presentation, community gun violence, meaning gun violence between and among members of the community happening in public spaces, most often with guns, that is the type of violence that has escalated most dramatically during the pandemic and is causing the vast majority of the homicides. So this is not a conversation about all violence generally. It's a conversation about community gun violence specifically. We know a lot about this type of violence. The first thing we know is that it's incredibly concentrated, both geographically and demographically. In most US cities, half of murders involve less than 0.06 of the city's population. And in 4%, and in terms of geography, about 4% of all city blocks account for more than half of all crime. And what we know is that when you look across hundreds of evaluations, we see that the most concentrated approaches, not surprisingly, outperform those that are less concentrated, the ones that focus on these small numbers of people and places that are disproportionately driving the problem. We see this in the evidence for policing, gang prevention, reentry, but we also see it in the evidence for public health, where we see secondary and tertiary prevention outperforming primary prevention. Now, some people might worry that there's a concern such as displacement, where if you focus on one group of people or one group of places, the crime will just relocate. Luckily, we have 30 years of social science that suggests that that happens rarely, and when it does happen, it happens only to a small extent. So this type of targeting is extremely well warranted. The next thing we know is that community gun violence responds to both rewards and punishment. I have to say that I personally was surprised that when I scanned hundreds of evaluations, I was surprised to see roughly even support in the evidence for both soft and tough approaches. And perhaps that's not surprising. We need prevention to divert future offenders, but we also need enforcement to deter or incapacitate current offenders. And if you look across the country, really there's no city that has successfully used only one approach or the other. You need to combine the two and have a balance of carrots and sticks. We also know, and Rick hinted to this, that community gun violence thrives on injustice. It's closely connected to legitimacy, and generally speaking, less fairness leads to more violence. We saw that after police violence in Ferguson and certainly in Minneapolis. And there's two bodies of evidence that discuss this: procedural justice and legal cynicism. In terms of procedural justice, there are many studies that show that a lack of trust and confidence in police will result in less compliance and, in fact, more violence. And that's because if people don't believe in the process, they won't obey it. Similarly, legal cynicism suggests that when communities don't believe in the criminal justice system, they withdraw from it. They don't use it, meaning they don't call 911. They don't use the criminal justice system for perhaps its oldest function, which is the nonviolent resolution of disputes. And so simmering conflicts are more likely to turn violent because they're not calling the police to help resolve them. And so one of the things that we need to understand from this is that reforms that enhance legitimacy, and I'll come back to this at the end, can complement violence reduction strategies and should be done simultaneously. So with these three observations, violence is concentrated. It responds to both rewards and punishments, and it thrives on injustice. You can derive three fundamental principles in terms of what effect is effective in terms of reducing violence, and that's focus, balance, and fairness. Because gun violence is concentrated, focus strategies are best. Because it responds to both incentives and disincentives, you need balanced approaches. And because it is exacerbated by injustice, you need fairness, meaning that whatever you do in the name of violence reduction needs to be perceived as fair and legitimate by those most impacted. These are the three key principles of violence reduction. And these are spelled out in some detail in my book, Bleeding Out. But now I want to turn to a different effort, a more recent, and that book was published in 2019. I think it's still extremely relevant. But I want to talk to you about a recent effort that I chaired at the Council on Criminal Justice, and that is the Violent Crime Working Group. It's 16 members. It was launched in July of 2021, and we convened leaders from every single sector of the field: community leaders, public health experts, law enforcement officials, and several prominent academics. We met 11 times, we produced 3 reports, we held 3 live web events, and we issued 7 policy bulletins. And I really urge you to visit our website, the Violent Crime Working Group website at the Council on Criminal Justice, because I really think that in a very practical sense, we have created something of a one-stop shop for how to effectively reduce violence right now. But right now, I want to talk about our final report, and that is the 10 essential actions for cities to reduce community gun violence now. And our goal with this report was not to be comprehensive, but to identify the 10 most important steps that were likely to make the greatest immediate impact. Now, these actions aren't a substitute for longer-term strategies to address root causes like poverty or inequality, but they are things that can immediately address the issue that we're facing right now. So what are some of these 10 essential actions? One is to set a clear goal by committing to saving lives by stopping violence, meaning that if you want to reduce violence, you have to actually focus on that directly. And the Violent Crime Working Group suggested an annual reduction of 10% in homicides and shootings with injury. The next thing you have to do is you have to, as we discussed before, identify the key people and places driving the violence. Who are your hot people and where are your hot spots? And you need to perform a rigorous problem analysis to know with specificity precisely who those people and places are. After that, you need to create a citywide plan. That's step number 3 for engaging these people and places, because you're not going to have one strategy. You're going to have multiple strategies all focused on these people and places. And because that can be a complex business, you can't just leave it, you can't just do it in an ad hoc way. You need a plan. Fourth, when you're talking about your people-based strategies, when you're working with the highest risk people, the people most likely to shoot or be shot, you need to approach them with a combination of empathy and accountability. Yes, you need law enforcement approaches like hotspots policing, focused deterrence, sometimes targeted gun controls, but you also need supports and services such as cognitive behavioral therapy, subsidized employment, and other forms of services. There's a similar theme when you're talking about the highest risk places, which are not whole neighborhoods, but instead micro locations. Of course, they're going to need increased law enforcement attention often through something known as hotspots policing and using problem-oriented strategies there. But you also have to invest in them as well. And so finally, I see I'm very close to my 10 minutes. I want to conclude, these aren't all 10, but I want to tell you one of the most important ones, which is you have to place responsibility for violence reduction at the top. And in cities, that means the mayor. And one of our most concrete recommendations is that every single city that has a serious issue with community gun violence needs a deputy mayor or a city official who is responding directly to the mayor in an office in order to do that effectively. So those are some of the essential actions. And so what you'll see is I haven't talked about specific strategies. I've really talked about a management structure and some key philosophies, because while you need evidence-based strategies, how you implement those strategies is absolutely critical. And with that, I'll turn it back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I'm really excited to get into a conversation. Before we do that, we have a recording from Dr. Chico Tillman, who will hopefully be joining us toward the end of the session. But we will play his recording now on violence interruption.
My name is Dr. Chico Tillman, and I'm from the west side of Chicago. I was born and raised in the Austin community, which is probably one of the most violent communities in America. In Chicago, it has the highest crime rate numerically and has a population of about 100,000 people and has about over 100 homicides a year and about 200 shootings a year. Growing up in this community, I saw a lot of challenges. The culture was a little bit different. It's a lot of subculture things going on. And being in this community allowed me to get involved in things like gangs, be around people that had both positive and negative influences on me. In the 1990s, I ended up sentenced to 240 months in prison for my awareness of an open air drug market in the Austin community. And I did 16 years, 3 months in prison. eventually I was released and the laws were changed, and I discovered that I'd done 13 years excessively. As opposed to being upset about everything that has transpired in my life, I had an epiphany in prison and developed a life with God and was encouraged to change not only my situation, but impact the community that I came from. So I leveraged the relationships that I had established in prison and began to work for several violence prevention organizations, mainly the most famous one, or the most would probably be Cure Violence. I worked for Cure Violence as a outreach worker, a program manager, and also eventually became a senior program manager managing 26 sites. And that led to me becoming a national trainer, building out sites throughout the country from ideation to implementation. In addition to my work at Cure Violence, I wanted to deeply understand the challenges and problems that were happening not only in the community in which I grew up in, the Austin community, but the similar problems I've seen in vulnerable communities throughout the United States. So I started my journey back to school so that I could build my toolkit and build knowledge around different ways and manners to mitigate this violence that I've seen so prevalent in my community. On my journey back to school, in 2.5 years, I graduated with a bachelor's degree from Northeastern University, summa cum laude. I graduated 18 months with a master's with honors. And 6 years later, I graduated from the University of Illinois at Chicago with a PhD in criminology, law, and justice. This new perspective as a researcher gave me a different look at violence. So now I had this triadic perspective as one who had been an individual who was involved in violent activity or individual who had been at the highest risk. I also have been a direct service provider. And lastly, now I have a lens as a researcher. So this triadic perspective allowed me to look at violence in a much different way. By having this perspective, it has created opportunities that I never would have imagined. I went on to become the Youth Safety and Violence Prevention Executive Director at the YMCA of Chicago, a senior research fellow at the University of Chicago, currently executive director at Heartland Alliance Ready Chicago, but also it allowed me to become a subject matter expert with the White House on its 16-city initiative to quell violence in vulnerable communities throughout the United States. Some of my work have been looking at a phenomenon called desistance, looking at what agency and institution need to be in place to help individuals go from maladaptive behavior to a pro-social lifestyle. One of the reasons I'm really looking at this behavior change model is because many of the cities around the country are involved in street intervention, but one of the biggest gaps or challenges I'm seeing is we're having challenges helping individuals actually have long-term behavior change or change their lives on a trajectory toward a pro-social lifestyle. I committed my life toward not only violence prevention, but helping inspire other Black and Brown individuals from around the country and individuals who have been system impact, such as myself, change their life and instill hope in communities that has such pessimism because of some of the structural violence that occurred, the oppression, and the continual rejection by society. So now, not only do I act as a pillar of hope for those communities and a resource, but also I'm an agent of change to try to help obstruct and mitigate those things within their community that are aimed at destroying them. I'm excited about this conference because this conference gives me a platform to share some of the work I'm doing, not only on a national level, but in different localities to quell violence particularly gun violence that's prevalent in our nation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Tillman, for making that recording. We hope you can join us soon. I'll invite the other panelists to come on the screen for a conversation. And again, if you have any questions you'd like to put in the chat. Dr. Taxman, do you want to start us off?
Well, I was going to basically, Rick laid out for us that, and Tom also added that the legitimacy of the criminal legal system is one of the contributors, not only to violence, but also in terms of people's perception of who they are in society. And I guess, we're in an area of criminal justice reform, lots of discussions from policing to sentencing, and the JCRCs are doing a lot of work in these areas. But I'd like to hear from Tom and Rick as to what's the most important legitimacy issue that you think we should really tackle. Because remember, you've got a whole bunch of advocates out there who want to do work in their communities. So thinking about how to restore the legitimacy of the criminal legal system.
Wow, that's a really tall order to answer that in a concise way. I have to say, I focus on violence reduction, and I think the single biggest contributor and the most direct effect that we see is when we see a highly controversial use of police force against an individual, often racial minority, often unarmed, that there's often a huge spike in violence, not just necessarily in that community, but depending on how publicized it is, it can impact across the country. And so I believe, I am a person who focuses on first things first. I'm very concrete. I think that we really absolutely have to get these unlawful, at times unlawful, but always tragic uses of police force under control. And I think there's actually some good evidence in this space. And we've got some really promising work being done by the Police Executive Forum on de-escalation and teaching police something that's new to them here, but not new to police forces in other parts of the world, where they learn to use force, not just when they're legally allowed to, but when they have to, and using it as a last resort, and strategically and tactically, sometimes drawing out an interaction, and if necessary, even retreating, in order to increase the possibility that it can be resolved without force.
I endorse everything that Thomas just said, and let me just add one element. I certainly agree that in order to improve police community relationships, in particular with communities that have been hard hit by violence, and that would include police violence, accountability of officers who have engaged in misconduct, which has been proven, has to be increased. That's issue number one. But the other issue is to take very seriously the calls for other kinds of reforms that have come out of the movement that emerged after the George Floyd killing. And let me just emphasize the reform that would have the police do less of some of the activities that have fallen on the police by default. By this, I mean being the almost universal first responder for drug overdose incidents, when in fact other agencies are much better prepared in emergency medical training and services to handle those events. I don't think the police need in every instance to be the first responder to the everyday problems of the homeless and other troubled populations in our communities. Some of those incidents do require police presence, but many do not. So that kind of rethinking of moving activities out of the police department that are better handled by other agencies, allowing the police, by the way, to focus their attention on what I think most of us would like to see the police focus on, and that is reducing serious violent and serious property crime. So I would add those two reform elements to Thomas's list.
So I guess I'm going to ask the, difficult question. How do we get attention to those issues that both of you have raised? Because, the federal legislation that was designed to address some of the police accountability has basically fallen apart. Efforts to reallocate funding from one agency to the next, not just police, but, as we all know, in local government, that's a really difficult task to do. So I'm going to ask this other hard question. What should our JCRCs do in their community to, deal? I mean, both of you have given us some really solid ideas here, but what should they ask for? And
It is a hard question, and the first thing I'll talk about is sort of concrete changes in budgets and policies, and then the second thing I'll talk about is messaging and language. In terms of concrete policies, I think that I think very candidly that I think those of us on the sort of hard left progressive side made a poor choice in terms of messaging and policy by embracing abolitionist language such as defund. If you really dig into the budgets of things, you will understand that there's actually not enough money in law enforcement to fund enough. So I would suggest that we take a more traditional progressive role, which is more money for everything, and especially maybe additional funds to try to correct the imbalance. But I think defunding the police or drawing down on police budgets is counterproductive, particularly at a time of high violence. And frankly, it's a toxic political message that you can already see is being seized on in an election year. So I would say more money for community-based approaches, more money for alternative responders and those things, but not at the expense of law enforcement. I would also say that we need to pursue a lot of these reforms in concrete, incremental ways. We have to be problem solvers, not necessarily focused on winning an argument. And we have to accept, in some cases, modest improvements or modest changes at first that can build up over time. And then in terms of messaging, I think that we are in a very unhealthy place in our national conversation on criminal justice. And it's a place where the public at large is presented with a false choice. And it's a false choice between absolutes. You either care all about reform or you care only about crime. You're all about safety or you're all about justice. And really the science, the evidence, and I think common sense says that we need both. We need both at the same time. And so what I would suggest is for those of you who are on the sort of more extreme left, I think you have to be careful about embracing sort of the language and concept of abolitionism. And for those of you on the right, I think you need to be very careful about seeing public safety issues as only a matter of law enforcement, police, prosecutors, courts, and corrections. And so I would say that we all need to sort of look inward and challenge our priors a little bit and be willing to work across the aisle and work with some unconventional partners.
Let me just add that I've always thought the defunding slogan and movement puts the cart before the horse. The first priority, and this would be for local organizations, is to survey your community to find out what the community wants from its police department. Does the community want the police to be the first responders to drug overdose, for example, the first responders to the day-to-day problems in living experienced by the homeless and other troubled people in our communities? And if not, then decide just how many of those activities can be moved elsewhere, and what impact that might have on the police budget. It's conceivable the police budget could go down, though I tend to agree with Thomas. I think in general, the budgets are too lean at present. But it's conceivable the budget could change once those decisions have been made. So Faye asked, what can local organizations do? One thing they can do is to help find out through surveys, focus groups, and other means just what your community wants its police department to do and what it would prefer other agencies to handle. Then decide the budget question. One final note, we have good historical evidence on what abolishing the police means to a community. Under Jim Crow, the police had a twofold response to crime in African-American communities. One was to enter the community sporadically, often engaging in unconstitutional or brutal acts. But the other, the more pervasive response, was not to enter the community at all. Those communities were by and large left on their own. In effect, the police were abolished in those communities. The broader community relied on racial segregation to control crime, quote unquote. The result was those communities had to fend for themselves, and that contributes to violence. So abolishing the police strikes me as simply wrongheaded, and there's good evidence for why it's a terrible idea.
I'm wondering about the kinds of violence interruption and violence prevention programs that Dr. Tillman mentioned in his reporting. And I'm wondering if you could share examples of those kinds of programs that you've seen and where they've been successful and what makes them successful.
Sure. So the Violent Crime Working Group did a deep dive on those types of strategies. And in fact, many of our members, such as Chico was a member of the Violent Crime Working Group. So we're all friends here. We've all worked together at the council and elsewhere. So we put together some things. And so some of the leading community-based interventions combine, cognitive behavioral therapy, subsidized employment. They often use street outreach, meaning people often who are trusted by the community, both to bring them into services and also to mediate conflicts. Hospital-based violence interruption, which is doing much of this work in an emergency room setting, taking advantage of that sort of teachable moment when someone is injured due to gun violence. And then finally, sort of environmental crime prevention, changing the physical makeup of crime locations, often by addressing blight and sort of doing cleaning and greening efforts. So the general thing that we've seen is that these efforts are all quite promising, and when implemented well, can have modest to moderate impacts on crime and violence. The only one that is, I think, firmly established as evidence-based is cognitive behavioral therapy, but the rest have a reasonably strong base of evidence. But none of these strategies have ever been tested or have ever been shown to be effective in terms of a one-shot deal, in terms of being able to, by themselves, reverse the tide in a city. So it's very important to understand that you shouldn't oversell these programs. These programs need to be an important part of an overall portfolio, but you can't rely on them exclusively to sustainably reduce violence. But I would say this, they are underfunded, and we are currently out of balance. We are relying too much on law enforcement right now and not enough on these programs.
Well, and I want to add to that. So, a lot of the violence prevention programs, particularly when they use people who have had former involvement, they tend to want people to volunteer their time instead of actually be paid. And so there is a movement to really develop certification for people so they could, have an actual profession as being a violence interrupter. And I think that's really important because, as Tom said, we haven't funded a lot of these initiatives. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which, is lauded in the research literature, less than 10% of the clinical programs actually adhere to those sort of principles. So, and a lot of that has to do with the availability of funding.
Faye, let me just add, there are places that have invested heavily in community-based programs, cure violence specifically. Let me talk a bit about my own city of St. Louis. St. Louis invested up to $7 million in a cure violence program that operates in just 3 of the 79 neighborhoods of the city. I did an evaluation of whether cure violence, where it had been operating in over a year, had any impact on violent crime and gun violent crime reduction in those communities. And I didn't find any evidence. When I compared the cure violence sites to other sites that were similar in demographic makeup, socioeconomic status, I didn't find any greater reductions where cure violence operated. That's not to say that cure violence failed. It's simply to say that if it's going to have an effect, at least based on the St. Louis evidence, that effect may not occur within the relatively short run. I should add, though, that cure violence, the violence interrupters in the local St. Louis Cure Violence Program are paid, are well-trained, and I could not agree more with Thomas that we cannot simply rely on a single strategy or approach. We have to rely on a combination of approaches. And I would argue that in addition to cure violence in those communities where it operates, focused deterrence, which we can talk more about if you like, Thomas mentioned it, is another strategy that has been shown to be effective and indeed at far lower cost.
Yeah, I would love to talk more about these kinds of other strategies to interrupt and prevent violence. And I'm wondering too, as we think about our Jewish communities who engage with advocacy work across the country in their cities and states, what are the kinds of policies that you're thinking about around public safety? How do you kind of define public safety? What constitutes an investment in public safety? And if we're kind of thinking about the rise in crime and the ways that it's kind of in New York, I'm seeing this play out every day where we see a rise in violent crime, and immediately people connect that to criminal justice reforms that have been made here and kind of demand the rollbacks of those things. And also blaming decarceration that happened during the pandemic as well. And I'm kind of wondering how you both think broadly about public safety in ways that don't necessarily draw that line directly between criminal justice reform and rise in violent crime, and thinking about how our Jewish communities want to engage in advocacy. What are the kinds of policies they should be thinking about, the investments they should be looking at, kind of beyond criminal justice reform, if we're thinking about behavioral mental health policies around that, housing, all kinds of things.
It's a great question. I believe that, this is just my personal individual opinion. Unfortunately, I am only Jewish on my father's side. But if I could speak to the community, we have had experiences with being outsiders, and we've been, and we obviously have had direct experience with the devastating consequences of being outsiders. And I think that, and yet at the same time, we have much more freedom and much more liberty and much more prosperity than many others in the United States, if we're talking crudely in terms of averages and things like that. I believe that we can be ambassadors and that we can see many sides to an issue and try to bring people together. And that's what this issue needs more broadly. And I think that, to bring people together, and is a central thing. In terms of the specific policies, I think that we have to understand that the public safety concerns are real, and they're real to our brothers and sisters who live in marginalized communities, most of all. And I think we have to be cognizant of that, and we have to be sensitive to that. And we can't try to change the subject by saying, well, what is safety really? And what is, for people who live in dangerous communities, it means I don't want to get shot. I don't want to get beat up. And anything other than that sounds like not a serious conversation. So we need to embrace that people need to be safe, and we need to be urging people to do those things. But at the same time, there's a lot of fear mongering out there about certain reforms that suggest that they're responsible for increasing danger in the United States. And that's often not true. It's certainly not true in the case of bail reform, for instance. But you can't just simply dismiss those concerns. You have to address them and say that's an important concern. Is there evidence to substantiate that? If yes, we would change it. If not, let's pursue it. And I think you have to have this conversation again and again and again, that you can have reform and public safety at the same time.
Yeah, on the issue of criminal justice reform, one of the kind of headlines I've been looking at recently suggests that in communities or cities with quote unquote progressive prosecutors, there has been a rise in violence, but presumably not in other cities. And as Thomas well knows, because of the work we've been doing for the Council on Criminal Justice, we found the rise in violence to cut across nearly every city we looked at, regardless of how progressive the local prosecutor was, or for that matter, the party affiliation of the mayor. The mayor's party affiliation has nothing to do with the conditions we've been discussing that give rise to increases in or high levels of violence. So what can local Jewish organizations do? Point out continuously that whether you have a progressive or a more traditional prosecutor doesn't seem to make any difference in terms of what's happening to violence in your community. Beat that drum and demand any contrary evidence from the other side. And I agree with Thomas. If the other side produces credible evidence, it has to be taken seriously. So far, I don't see the credible evidence on that side of the argument.
I think another big area that we could devote that at local advocates is actually, dealing with the funding situation in the disadvantaged, disenfranchised communities. Often those communities, as Thomas noted, has a lot of blight. There's a lot of issues in terms of the quality of housing, issues regarding, access to food stores, just normal activities. And so we've let some of these communities really decay in a way that if we actually built up, we would be able to strengthen the community capacity to, control violence, crime, other types of, mental health and substance use issues.
That will take some time. It's a complicated effort that you're proposing. In cities where there's a good deal of decay and blight, what one sees is massive depopulation of those communities. And so what city leaders are faced with is the choice dilemma of investing in communities that are depopulating day by day, or investing in communities that are remain somewhat more stable. And that's a politically fraught argument. That argument occurs in my own city and occurs in many others. So we have to be very clear about the characteristics of the communities that we want to invest in. And if a community is massively depopulated, we have to ask the question, is that where scarce investment funds are most needed?
to respond to Faye and to Robert Lankin's comment in the chat, I think this is a very important issue. And, I think this is a classic correlation causation issue. We know that poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity are highly correlated with crime, violence, and other forms of social dysfunction. However, when you dig down and look for a causal before, after, if, then relationship, it is much, much, much murkier. Remember that crime declined during the Great Depression. It rose during the booming 60s and stayed flat during the Great Recession. We see that a similarly complicated initiative or relationship with inequality, also with the broadest sort of indicators of opportunity. So, of course, those things matter, and of course, they should matter to us more broadly in this community. But one of the things that I think people don't understand is that if you were really concerned about these marginalized communities, sometimes the relationship is stronger in reverse, meaning that it is chronic exposure to high levels of violence that are impacting people's public health outcomes, that are impacting their housing and education, that are impacting the ability of those neighborhoods to both retain population and attract commercial and economic investment. As I say in my book, I'm not suggesting that controlling violence is the only thing you need to do in order to change the trajectories of these marginalized neighborhoods. I'm not even suggesting that it's the most important thing. What I am suggesting, what I'm arguing, and I think there's a lot of evidence for, is that it is the first thing in terms of sequence. So I urge you, do not look away from this issue. Do not change the subject. Do not try to argue around it. The first thing you must do is provide a measure of safety. And just so you know, we're apparently Rabbi Haber as a fire alarm going on in her neighborhood. So that's why we lost her.
Yes. So my dear colleague, Bruce Turnbull, who co-chairs the criminal justice reform as part of JCPA, basically wanted to also reiterate to the local JCRCs that we should find groups in our communities who are working on these issues and partner with those groups. At an earlier session today, JCPA announced a new partnership with NAACP that would really offer a lot of opportunities, both at the national level, but at the local level. And our group, and Bruce in particular, works with a number of other organizations that have local affiliates that would be really important to partner with, to take upon the advice that Tom and Rick basically said, which is get to know your community, understand the nature of the problem, and focus attention on those drivers of violence. So we're almost at the end. We have one other question. Instead of having higher public safety and more criminal justice reform, why not less public safety and greater sentences for those who are truly violent?
I can take a swing at that. It's a very interesting idea, Steve, but candidly, I don't think it will work, and here's why. Everything we know about deterrence suggests that there are three qualities of deterrence that make it important: the swiftness of this deterrent, the severity of the deterrent, and the certainty of this deterrent. The most important thing, again and again, that we see is that people are deterred more by swift punishments and certain punishments, not necessarily severe punishments. And that's in fact why the death penalty appears to have no impact on crime or violence, because it's a very severe punishment that's somewhat arbitrarily administered. So Steve, it's a great outside the box suggestion, but I think probably wouldn't work.
Hear, hear.
So we are at the end of our time. Let's thank Rick Rosenfeld and Thomas Abt for their insights today. And we really thank you for sharing your time today and appreciate everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thanks to Dr. Tillman as well.